This tutorial will describe the most common experiment settings that you will configure when setting up an experiment. For complete information about all settings, please see the presentation documentation. The text file encoding setting determines how presentation interprets text data when reading or writing text files. This includes experiment files and scenario files, as well as input and output text files and log files. You will almost always want to set this to UTF-8, with only rare exceptions. The experimenter control keys on the main keyboard for pausing, resuming, and quitting scenarios may be configured to different keys or disabled entirely by selecting none. It is not possible to disable both quit actions. However, you can select to use a 3-key sequence instead of the escape key for cases in which the subject is using the keyboard. When you click to start a scenario, presentation will first analyze the scenario file and then load stimulus data. When it is ready to actually begin the scenario, it can wait for a return key press before continuing. To continue immediately without waiting, uncheck this box. You may also suppress the display of the stimuli loading and ready screens for visual scenarios. For STL-only scenarios, the first trial by default will start at scenario time 0. If you want to insert some time before the first trial begins, you may enter a time here. This is not true of scenarios using PCL, so in all other cases you will probably set this to 0. The report setting determines if the analyzer window appears after a scenario. While writing an experiment, you may want it to always appear, but never when running subjects. You may also only display it if any event's uncertainty measurements exceed some threshold. The response panel is used to select which buttons and axes on which devices are used for each scenario in the experiment. Details of this panel will be covered in a separate tutorial. The video panel contains settings for the display devices used for visual scenarios. The adapter setting determines which display will be used. The primary display driver option usually refers to the monitor on which the Windows Start menu appears. If you have other monitors attached to your Windows desktop, other options will appear. The display mode setting allows you to change the display mode of the display when the scenario is run. It will be changed back to the Windows setting when the scenario is finished. The current setting option uses whatever display mode to Windows is currently set. The other options that appear are provided by the graphics card drivers. The Legacy Mode checkbox refers to an implementation of the visual stimulus features used by older versions of presentation. This mode has been retained for backward compatibility. Many visual features, such as 3D and advanced video features, will not function in Legacy Mode. Although scenarios which will run in either mode should appear identical, if you have an experiment that was previously run in Legacy Mode or an old version of presentation with only one mode, you may want to keep that setting to ensure that nothing changes. Otherwise, you will generally always want to leave this box unchecked. Presentation uses Windows to render fonts for text stimuli, so it is possible for Windows settings to affect how the text appears. In most cases, you will want to avoid this by checking both boxes in the Fonts box so that text stimuli always appear the same. Presentation can display stimuli on multiple monitors simultaneously. To do this, add another display and configure it. The settings in the Display Device box and ICM Profile box are per display, while the font settings are common to all. The Audio panel contains settings for the audio device used for scenarios with audio. The primary sound driver option refers to the default Windows playback device. This device may also be listed separately by name along with any other playback devices. The sound format is a common format used to mix sounds played by presentation. If the sounds you provide have a lower resolution, presentation will upsample the data automatically. Likewise, if your sounds have a different sampling frequency, they will be resampled. Depending on the mixing mode and operating system, the sound format may or may not be the actual format used by the sound card prior to analog conversion. See the presentation documentation for more details. The mixer options refer to the method used to mix sounds played by presentation. The different mixer options have different capabilities and timing characteristics, and also differ from XP to Vista and Windows 7. If you are only playing stereo sounds and don't care about playback latency, you can select DirectX software for maximum portability. Otherwise, you should consult the presentation documentation to fully understand the implications of each option. You can instruct presentation to reset the Windows device volumes and application volume levels before each scenario is run. This option will prevent any incidental change to the Windows volume from affecting the volume of your auditory stimuli. The Log Files panel contains settings which affect the contents and file names of the data files produced for each scenario. You will generally always want to produce the General Event List, which contains information for all recorded events during the scenario. A set definition file contains a list of instructions used to organize data in the Analyzer window and can also produce secondary data files for each scenario. You can specify a different file for each experiment or each scenario. The Analyzer will be covered in separate tutorials. The settings in the Log Output File Names box, in combination with the Log File Directory setting, determine the file names of the log file produced. By default, they will use the scenario file names with a .log extension. Regardless of other options, it is advisable to check the box to append counter to file name if file exists. This will ensure that nothing is overwritten should you need to restart any scenario during a single run of the experiment. If you are using the subject name ID option, the value entered will appear in an extra data column of the general event list for every event. It may also be included in the log file name.